Dear students, we will be covering in this module the population trends at global level and also presenting it continent-wise. It is very important that we need to understand the population parameters, how the situation is occurring over a period of time in different regions and also in the world as a whole. It's mainly interested to know how the size of population that was earlier moved to the present situation, and also the various demographic parameters, how they responded given the development issues that are experienced by different regions of the world. In this context, this module is devoted to focus on the various trends in the demographic aspects. Let's begin with the size of population. If you look at the global level, the population in the earlier, for instance, in 1994, the total population of the world was 5.6 billion and it rose to 6.4 billion in 2005, further increased to 9.5 billion it is expected by 9.5 billion in 2050, and at the current level it is about 7+ billion in the world. If we focus continent-wise, the highest proportion of the population is in the Asian region. While up to 1994, Europe had the second highest proportion of population, that is almost a 3-time increase from 1950 of 2.5 billion, whereas if you look at the less developed regions, for instance, Asia's share of the total population is as high as 4.3 billion, followed by Africa 1.1 billion and Europe 0.7 billion. And it clearly indicates that after 1994, Africa had the second highest proportion of population. If over a period of time, how the population size has moved across world as a whole and also with respect to developed regions, less developed regions and least developed regions, it is very clearly seen that the more developed regions no doubt have started its increasing size of population, but the growth of population is mainly in the case of less developed regions and to a certain extent in least developed countries. Similarly, if we look at continent-wise, the growth rate is very high in the case of Africa, Asia and Latin America, whereas in the case of Europe and other parts of America and also Oceania, the growth is to the significant level when compared to the regions of Asia and Africa. Now let us look at population density. While world population density has shown its increase from 19.3 persons per square kilometer in 1950, it is as high as 46.5 persons per square kilometer in 2000, which is almost an increase to the extent of 3 times since 1950. Again, with respect to more developed and less developed regions, if we see the density of population, the density is lesser in the case of more developed region. Its growth is slightly lesser compared to less developed region. For instance, in 1950, while more developed regions had population density of 16.4 persons, it has only to increase to 24 persons in 2000. While in the same corresponding period, if we look at the scenario in less developed regions, while in 1950 it was 21.2 persons, it is as high as 60.5 persons in 2000, which clearly indicates that the density is higher and higher in the case of less developed regions, whereas more developed regions it is slightly lesser. Similarly, if we look at the regional variations, Asia has the highest density of population, as high as 141 persons per square kilometer, whereas a region like Oceania, where only 4.6 persons are noticed per square kilometer. And overall, world as a whole, the density is 56.1% in 2014, which clearly indicates the regional wise variations. Similarly, if we look the graph where the world more developed and less developed over a period of time, the data on population density shows clearly the steady increase which is attributed to the population size over a period of time and its growth. Similarly, if we look at the projections, it is clear that less developed countries are going to have a very high population, which is expected to be almost 9 billion by 2050, people concentrating on located in less developed countries. And the clear message in this is that the growth is going to be more and more in less developed countries and in these regions. What about the urbanization effect? If we look at the urbanization process, while in the world as a whole, during the period 1950 to 2014, the increase was to the extent of below 30% to 54%. It is expected to be around 66% by 2050. It is almost double compared to 1950 figure. Same in the case of regional wise variations in terms of urbanization. The data clearly shows that it is as high as 80% in Latin America and Caribbean. Northern America, urbanization is very high, whereas in the case of Europe, it is 73%, and furthermore it may be 80% by 2050, and the continents of Africa and Asia, which are predominantly rural, the urbanization is as low as 40 and 48% respectively. Overall, it clearly shows that worldwide the increased urbanization is expected over the next few decades, and the fastest urbanization is going to be in the less developed countries and regions like Africa and Asia, which are going to be projected to be of 56% and 64%, and the rate of urbanization in Asia and Africa is as low as 1.5%, 1.1% annually. That clearly indicates that no doubt proportion of urban population is going to increase, but it is going to be steady and at lower levels. The major contributor factor for urbanization, which is measured in terms of net migration. If you look at the data during period 1950 to 2000, the international migration, which is added to the population, is mainly observed to be in Northern America and Oceania, and which is a negative net migration is noticed in continents Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean island. More developed countries no doubt have experienced a positive net migration, which is mainly due to rise in population, whereas in the case of less developed regions, there is a negative net migration and also there is a decrease in the population. What it clearly indicates that the net migration figures annually, if we look at the data between 1990 to 2000, in more developed regions, it is to the extent of 2.6 million, whereas projections are going to show that it is going to be reduced to 2.2 million by 2050. In contrast, if we look at the less developed regions or even least developed countries, it is going to be mildly positive. Net migration is observed, especially which was noticed in 1990 to 2000, primarily due to refugee repatriation flows after several decades of negative net migration, and the projection shows that immigration from least developed to more developed countries is going to affect net migration, which is expected around 2050. Currently, the number of international migrants in terms of the absolute number, if we see the more developed countries, the share is to the extent of 136 million, and less developed countries is 96 million, and the least developed countries are having the least of 11 million. Overall, if you look at the birth and death rates in the world as a whole, there is a decline in the birth rates, further decline in the death rate, which clearly indicates the significant rise in the population, and that if we look further, that the world population no doubt has shown increase during the period, say for example between 2010 to 2015, and overall population increase again has been noticed in the case of birth and death rates, which have contributed significantly. In this process, if you look at the global birth rates and death rates during the period 1950 to 2055, the data clearly shows that the birth and death rates no doubt are going to come down significantly, but the reduction in the birth rate is not to the extent when assessing in the case of death rate. While analyzing the mortality data, it is very important to take into consideration age-wise the rates and its corresponding contributory factors. One of the important indicators in this case is measured through infant mortality. Infant mortality rate, while world as a whole, if you look at since 1950, there is a steady decline. For instance, while it was as high as 142 in the world in 1950, came down to 57 in 2000, and further reduction to the extent 36 IMR is noticed in 2015. What this clearly indicates that almost it is a 4 times of reduction that has occurred. And if we look at the countries, especially the less developed and least developed, the decline also started showing its improvement, reduction. Overall, the more developed countries, if we compare, the IMR is as low as 5 at the current rate of 2015, while less developed regions still are experiencing an infant mortality rate of 39, while IMR was as high as 161 in 1950. And furthermore, in least developed regions, it is still very high to the extent of 57, but when we compare with 1950, which had a very high infant mortality rate of 203. Let's see the projections. If we see the projections of infant mortality rate, the world as a whole are going to experience only 17 infant mortality rate, whereas region-wise data shows that IMR is going to be as low as 3 in more developed region. In less developed regions, it is going to be 19, and in the least developed regions, as high as 26, which clearly indicates that there is a requirement of major emphasis should be in the case of less developed and least developed region for bringing down infant mortality rate. Then only we can say that our overall mortality has come down across different regions. Similarly, if you look at the reductions in infant mortality rate across different regions and world as a whole, there is no doubt a steady decline over a period of time. Let's discuss about sex ratio, which is an indication of the extent of gender bias that exists in the society. If you look at the world as a whole, the sex ratio was to the extent of 106 to 108, which was in 1950 to 55 to 2010 to 2015, indicating clearly that more males than females worldwide with a little variation. In the case of more developed regions, the range is to the extent of 106 and 105, whereas in the case of less developed region, 105 to 108, whereas in the case of least developed regions, it is going to be as low as 104. Overall, it clearly shows that the least developed regions, there is a scope for bringing on par with males. The emphasis should be by focusing on more female, and also the related to fertility, there is a need to focus so that our crude birth rate can take care of these dimensions. In this regard, it is important to focus on total fertility rate. If you look at last several decades, no doubt the total fertility rate started showing its declining trend in most of the developed countries and furthermore in the less developed countries. For example, if you look at the pace of decline in total fertility rate, the faster is the response to fertility reduction is shown in less developed countries, reducing the gap with the developed regions. If you look at the data, as high as TFR of 2.8, which was in more developed regions in 1950 to 1955, has come down to 1.6 children per woman in 2000 to 2005. And furthermore, if we look at in 2005 to 2007, the reduction is 1.7 children, and furthermore 1.67 children in 2010 to 2015, and projection shows that it is going to be below replacement level of 1.9 children per woman by 2045 to 2050. TFR with respect to less developed and least developed regions also clearly shows that there is a steady decline in over a period of time. For example, in less developed regions, 6.1 children per woman is the norm that noticed in period 1950 to 1955, has come down to 2.7 by 2010 to 2015, and the projection shows that it is going to come down only to 2.3 in the year 2045 to 2050. And if you look at the data with respect to least developed regions, while in the case of 1980 period to 1985, during that period, the TFR is as high as 6.6, has come down to 4.6 in 2005 to 2010, and further reduction has been noticed by 2010 to 2015, and the projected data shows that it is going to be 2.9 by 2045 to 2050. The graph clearly shows how the total fertility rate variations and the trends that are noticed in the world and also in the overall other regions, which clearly indicates that across the globe, irrespective of developing regions, there is a reduction that is noticed in the total fertility rate, which is a welcoming feature. Let's discuss about life expectancy at birth, which is an important indicator to reflect on the achievements in health. Worldwide, there is a gain in life expectancy over a period of time, and the less developed regions have experienced less than the situation that is noticed in the case of more developed regions. The data if you look at during the period now 2005 to 2010, more developed countries have 80 years in this period. It is shown that life expectancy is as high as 74 years in Latin America and Caribbean, whereas in the case of Asia, it is 69 years, and developing Oceania, it is as low as 65 years, and the least is noticed in African continent, which is almost as low as 55 years. If we analyze the differences, which clearly indicates that each of these countries which are experiencing different stages of demographic transition is also reflected in the data on life expectancy. What clearly shows is that the developed countries which have started their demographic transition successfully in the 19th century, and by mid-20th century, the life expectancy at birth was more than 70 years. In the case of most developing countries, it began transition very late and reached survival rates faster by 2005 to 2010, especially in the parts of Latin America, Caribbean, Asia and Northern Africa. The graph also clearly shows the life expectancy at birth, the changes over a period of time across different regions of the world. What about the under 5 mortality rate, which is also important for us to analyze when we look at the mortality trends? While in the world as a whole there is a steady decrease, but this is also shown a significant variations within different regions of the world. For instance, if we take the world as a whole, the childhood mortality was as high as 215 per thousand live births in 1950 to 55 and came down to 71 in 2005 and further declined to 50. Whereas in the case of less developed regions, the decline is much faster, which was seen that while it was 248 in 1950 to 55, came down to 54 in 2010 to 15, and projections indicate that it is going to be further decline. What it clearly indicates that the response in the reduction to childhood mortality is coming in a big way in most of the less developed regions, which is a positive indicator. This chart clearly depicts the variations in the levels of under 5 mortality rate over a period of time across different regions of the world and also globe as a whole. For instance, in 1960, while children aged 10 years, the ratio of 3 to 1, that ratio of between 25 to 20 years is as high as 5 to 1. Where in the case of 2000, the ratio between children and older persons was 2:1, has come down during the 25 to 29 years to older persons as high as 4.1. What it clearly indicates that the number of older persons is increasing compared to the children below the age group of 10 years. And furthermore, it is expected to increase further. If we look at the data related to different broad age groups, for instance, below 9 years, 10 to 24 years, 25 to 59 years, and above 60 years, these different age groups over a period of time clearly indicates that there is a steep rise in elderly population over the years, and it is expected to continue and followed by 25 to 29 years of young population, which indicates clearly that there is going to be a major shift in median age, which clearly leading to population aging. And that is how the age transition is experienced by different countries, which is reflected on the present situation of population aging. And the median age in the world and different regions and also different less developed or more developed regions over a period of time clearly shows that there is a steady increase in the median age of the population across these periods of time. The important another indicator is, given the age transition, what is the extent of dependency ratio and its changes in the world and also in the more developed and less developed region. What it clearly indicates is that while it was the highest number of dependents to the extent of 76 dependents per 100 working age persons, which was noticed in 1965, was in the world as a whole, while more developed regions had a high of 58 dependents, and in the case of less developed region, it was as high as 84 per 100 working age persons. While the situation changed in the time of during the period of 2010, where 52 dependents, which is coming down, and in the more developed regions, it is as low as 48 dependents, whereas in the case of less developed regions, it was 52 dependents per 100 working age persons. The projection shows in the dependency ratio that by 2050, the world as a whole is going to increase to 58. In the case of more developed regions, it is 72, and in less developed regions, 56, and the least developed countries, it's going to be 59, mirroring clearly the process of aging, how it is experiencing, and the share of older persons, how it is increasing in the world as a whole and in the more developed and least developed regions is also shown in this graph. By virtue of these changes in the different age groups, the obvious effect is on population aging, which is reflected through the share of older persons, and it clearly shows that in the world as a whole, the increase of elderly population has been seen from 8% in 1950 has increased to 12% by 2030, and the projection shows by 2050 there's going to be further increase to 21% in the next 4 decades. What it indicates is that population aging, not only in the world as a whole, its pace and stage of population aging is experienced across different regions, and furthermore, it is showing that the process which has just started in less developed regions is going to be in a big way, is going to significantly change and alter the age transition and also the proportion of population across different age groups. That is, in that case, there is a significant regional variations that are noticed across the globe. So, the proportion of population of 60 plus in the total population and also over a period of time across the world and developed and less developed regions clearly indicated in the figure, which shows that there is a steady increase in the elderly population. Overall, if we look at in the global context and also in the area of more developed and less developed region context, the demographic scenario is very, very clearly showing that in the case of demographic transition, if we look at world as a whole, most of these regions are experiencing, and the pace in which the demographic transition has achieved in the more developed region is almost completed, and in the process, population aging is significant. The same trend is noticed in the case of less developed regions. However, the less developed regions are going to experience in much, in a shorter period, and in the context of that, what the demographic issues are going to emerge is that there is going to be age transition. The transition in the fertility mortality is expected, and furthermore, it has shown its tremendous effect on aging of population. So, given this, it is very important to understand that the world and more developed and less developed regions, the trend is going to be significant. What the developed countries have achieved as of now, the demographic transition is now also going to be followed in less developed and least developed regions, and in the process, the effect of development, whether it is going to influence less developed regions or not, the demographic transition is going to impact the population aging in a big way in the less developed regions, and that is where the quality of life of this elderly population has to be looked into so as to see that we can have a age-integrated society.